night. So by the time they wake up.
Yeah, we welcome today Professor Alena Rettová to our forum. Thank you so much for being here. Alena Rettová is Professor of African and Afrophone Philosophies at the University of Bayreuth, Germany, where she leads an ERC-funded project on philosophy and genre, creating a textual basis for African philosophy. Her books include African Philosophy, History, Trends, Problems, 2001, Afrophone Philosophies, Reality and Challenge, 2007, and Chanter l'existence, la poésie de Sando Marteau et ses horizons philosophiques, 2013. Recently, she has co-edited with Benedetta Lanfranchi and Miriam Paul, Critical Conversations in African Philosophy, Asikope, Let's Talk, 2001. Thank you so much, Professor Rettová. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for this generous introduction, for this one, and for this invitation. I'm really honored and very pleased to be able to deliver a paper in this forum that I have been following for quite some time. And it is always populated by very inspiring papers and people. So I really do feel very honored. I would like to give a talk about the recent developments in African philosophy. Let me share my screen. This one, right. Like that, yeah. Actually, let me picture somewhere where it will not be in the way. Okay, so the title of my talk is Between Normative Idealism and Critical Realism, the Shifting Landscapes of African Philosophy since 1994. The paper is based on an article that I published last year in a journal called Modern Africa. It's an article that was in the pipeline for quite some time, could not be published for various reasons. It was actually meant to map the last 25 years of African philosophy, so it was intended to be published in 2019. It appeared a little bit later, but I think that the information contained in there is still valid, or I still stand by it, except, of course, the current COVID crisis, and then who knows what happens with the political situation as it is at the moment in the world, how that will impact on African philosophy. I think that will perhaps be the next chapter. This is the outline of my paper. I would first like to suggest that there is a fundamental tension in African philosophy of the last roughly quarter of a century, which is defined by two very different tendencies, by two opposing tendencies. A certain optimism that issues from the overcoming of apartheid, especially in South Africa, which has indeed impacted on the whole of African philosophy. And then on the other hand, there is also the tension of the recent wars and genocide that have taken place in the continent, represented by the Rwandan Genocide of 1994. I will use several authors to demonstrate this tension and also to clarify why that is important for African philosophy and why that is a kind of fundamental tension that defines the field at the moment. I have called these two trends normative idealism and critical realism. These are my terms. You may disagree with them, you may use other ones, but I think the denotations are pretty clear in both cases. Edet calls this normative idealism conceptual Mandarinization. So there is a certain inspiration in the thought of Nelson Mandela to create a new vocabulary to speak about African life and African thought to use in African philosophy. And on the other hand, there is the very bitter and very vocal response to the Rwandan genocide on the part of Patrice Nganang, to speak for many others, who speaks of the Rwandan genocide as an entry into simple, that is, flawed humanity. So I think you can already now see the fundamental tension between these two trends, where the conceptual Mandarinization, of course, is founded on the pivotal concept of Ubuntu, humanity, and then this kind of humanity is being questioned and interrogated by scholars like Patrice Nganang. To conclude, I would like to go beyond this tension and outline some key trends, speak of certain key concepts, which I see as emerging in African philosophy, and which I see as defining the future of the field. As I said in the beginning, perhaps there will be yet another discussion on African philosophy following COVID and following well, what is becoming a world conflict at the moment. But I think for the time being, we can speak of certain vectors of the field, and that's under number 4. So to introduce the topic, I would just like to clearly and briefly define the field. The field that I'm speaking about is African philosophy following 1994, which is a year that was significant in the field for many reasons. One of them being the publication of Dismas Masolo's book, African Philosophy in Search of Identity, which I think is a culmination of a certain trend in African philosophy, a reflection of what happened in philosophy in the continent as a result of emancipation from colonialism and struggles for independence. So I see that book as really being a milestone in the field as a kind of reflection of what came before 1994. The year 1994, as I already said, has these two key events, the free elections in South Africa and the Rwandan genocide. It is also a time, the 1990s in general, when, as it were, there was a change of generations in African philosophy. New philosophers started being productive. In a way, the discussions shifted from what Jennifer West called the perverse dialogue. So the doubts about African thinking and African philosophy as such, even African humanity as such, this perverse dialogue has really been overcome already in the 1990s, and African philosophers were in a way free to think about other topics. Jonathan Chimakonam also speaks of a post-debate disillusionment. Of course, the disillusionment is one question, but I think the post-debate, the time after this debate about African philosophy, about the existence and nature of African philosophy, this is how he sees this time of the 1990s and onwards. The 1990s, of course, geopolitically were a very important time also for reasons that are sort of indirectly related to African philosophy. There was a certain hangover from the end of the Cold War, the loss of the dualism of power in the world created a certain political vacuum and aimlessness, which in a way redefined what was happening also in the field of African philosophy. And then we have these two trends there, conceptual Mandarinization. I really like this concept because I think that it sort of puts the spotlight on one thinker who, as it were, represents the new developments in African politics and in African history. And then on the other hand, the Rwandan genocide. If I may start with what I called normative idealism towards a conceptual Mandarinization. Of course, this concept is referring to the philosophy of Ubuntu, which has flourished in South Africa since the overthrowing of the apartheid. But of course, the concept has a long history and did not start in 1994. I would like to show or share with you sections from a poem in Xhosa, isiXhosa, by David Yali Manisi, who was a praise poet, who formulated as early as 1952 the basic principles of Ubuntu. So the mutual love among people, tanda abanya bantu or tanda nawenga bantu. So love other people and you will be loved. The poem is fairly long. I have just the first and the last stanzas here, but I think that already from these you can see the basic ideas of Ubuntu. The poem is called Ubuntu, and it clarifies how Ubuntu basically is the mutual relationship between or among people, and how you should reciprocate what other people do to you, mainly in the positive sense, so love and other positive acts and emotions. Now, if I say that this was a poem that was published as early as 1952, of course, that also does not mean that that was the year when the concept was coined. Of course, the word exists in Bantu languages. It exists in the whole of Bantu-speaking Africa and beyond. So really the concept has been there, but as Sulaiman Bashir often points out, the question is really when it became a philosophical concept. And one can really say that that was happening roughly around 1990. After 1994, of course, it was given this major political and philosophical role of clarifying what happened in South Africa and South African politics. Now, the word Ubuntu, the concept of Ubuntu, has been given a huge task. There is no modesty in how it was defined. Mogobe Ramose is undoubtedly one of the key theorists of the philosophy of Ubuntu, and in his very important book of 1999, which in a way defined the concept for philosophy, he says the following: Ubuntu is the root of African philosophy. The being of an African in the universe is inseparably anchored upon Ubuntu. Similarly, the African tree of knowledge stems from Ubuntu, with which it is connected indivisibly. Ubuntu then is the wellspring flowing with African ontology and epistemology. African philosophy has long been established in and through Ubuntu. So you can really see this huge task that has been given to the concept of Ubuntu. It is, and the being, the hyphenation is Ramose's writing, it is the being of an African which is encapsulated in that concept. It is an African philosophy that has a long history, that is rooted in African thought. It is the wellspring flowing with African ontology and epistemology. It simply contains everything, so to speak, that is important philosophically speaking to African philosophy and African people. Also, other scholars give similar importance to the concept. Augustin Schatt speaks of the idea of Ubuntu. He says, I will speak of the African vision. So you can see that for him, this is really the embodiment of African thought, African worldview or outlook. I do not want to suggest that there is only one, he says further, but we can read between the lines, he does really want to suggest that there is that major one. It must be remembered that I'm talking about traditional African ideas rather than contemporary ones, ideas that pre-exist the influence of European culture. So again, something that has been rooted in African cultures for centuries, and that is in a way unrelated to the colonial or European influence. This is, I think, really important. He says further, I'm not writing as an anthropologist. I'm not interested in African ideas just because they are African, nor in the whole range of African culture with its local differences. I'm interested only in a central set of ideas because they seem to be both true and important, and to supply something that our dominant scientific culture lacks. So again, something really important is in this quotation, Schatt suggests that these ideas are both true and important. So they are important regardless of their origin, of because they are African in origin, but they also contain something to tell the world, as it were. And he contrasts them with what he calls our dominant scientific culture. Finally, Archbishop Desmond Tutu calls Ubuntu the gift that Africa can give the world. He says, Africans have a thing called Ubuntu. It is about the essence of being human. It is part of the gift that Africa will give the world. It embraces hospitality, caring about others, being willing to go the extra mile for the sake of another. We believe that a person is a person through other persons, that my humanity is caught up, bound up inextricably with yours. When I dehumanize you, I inexorably dehumanize myself. The solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. Therefore, you seek to work for the common good because your humanity comes into its own in community, in belonging. Now, what is then this concept? What does it contain? How was it constructed? Purely linguistically speaking, Ubuntu is the abstract of the root Ubuntu, which means human, or can also mean other things, obviously, related to the way of being, or to humans, but also to things in some languages. It's almost like the key concept of the abstract terminology in many of these languages. Ubuntu means humanity, and it has cognates in other Bantu languages such as Sutu, where people call it Butu, Unu in Shona, Utu in Swahili, and it has also been in a way translated into English. For instance, Kenneth Kaunda spoke of Zambian humanism, so there is a clear influence of this thought on the way he spoke about it in English. And one has to say that a lot of scholars across Africa, also West African scholars, create a certain notional identity with this concept, although linguistically, of course, the words are not related, such as the concept of any young person in Yoruba, or the way Wamajecha speaks of the ethics of duty rather than the ethics of rights. Again, it is based on a certain understanding of community, of the human being. Sometimes it is also called communalism or communitarianism. So there is this kind of vast range of concepts that are seen as being related to this idea of Ubuntu. I have mentioned two other philosophies of Vutu, or if you like, Ubuntu, which are not directly linked to the philosophy of Ubuntu as it was elaborated in South Africa. Utu is a very important concept in Swahili philosophy. Again, it is the key philosophical concept of Swahili thought, as it were. It is present in so many poems, novels, and other texts. There are also proverbs and sayings that clarify what Utu means, which are really similar to the ones that are found in isiZulu or the other Southern African languages. Alexis Kagame from Rwanda also established his Bantu philosophy, as he called it, on this root of Ubuntu, and he speaks of 4 categories. As you can see, all of them have this root of Ubuntu in them: Ubuntu, Ikintu, Ahantu, Ubuntu. What is really important about Ubuntu is that humanity is seen as normative. So being human is not simply being the genetic setup of Homo sapiens, so to speak. Being human means you are ethically good, so to speak. Sometimes Ubuntu is also linked with personhood as a kind of qualifying concept. And secondly, Ubuntu insists on the primacy of community over the individual. Therefore, it is often linked to these notions of communitarianism and sometimes communalism. Now, Ubuntu in South African thought has been constructed as a reversal of identity construction. Instead of going from the I to the we, which is perceived to be the European way, so to speak, to the European philosophical way of constructing community. Here we are going from the we to the I, And there is that classic expression of it, Umuntu, ngumuntu, ngabantu. To be a human being, a human being is a human being through people, through other people. What is perhaps, if we go beyond this basic definition, what it means is that the human being is defined importantly through others, through appearances, acts, and relationships. So you are not you because of who you are inside, so to speak, how you are born and how you conceptualize yourself, but through the way you are conceptualized by others, by what you do, how you function in your society. Persons exist only in relation to other persons, and then life is seen as the process of becoming a person, becoming Ubuntu, acquiring these ethical qualities. Very importantly, of course, Ubuntu was connected with, as Schat says, the continuing dissipation of the spirit of apartheid, and in the extraordinary manifestations of forgiveness during the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, to quote the classic Morobe Ramose, this is how he defines Ubuntu, and I really see that as the kind of foundation of the definition of this concept as philosophy. He translates this Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Gabantu into Sesotho, moto ke moto kabato. To be a human being is to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others, he explains, and establish humane relations with them. And then he says that the attribution or the denial of humanity, kemutu, gasemutu, someone is a human being, someone is not a human being, expresses, as he says, a fundamental ethical, social, legal judgment of human worth and human conduct. He further, again, establishes a kind of Pan-African presence of this concept of Ubuntu, and he presents what he calls a linguistic analysis of the concept. He speaks of a family atmosphere, so he sees what he calls philosophical affinity and kinship among and between the indigenous people of Africa. And he goes on to specify what he means by that by saying it goes from the Nubian desert to the Cape of Good Hope and from Senegal to Zanzibar. He also says the Sahara Desert is not the indelible birthmark on Africa. And he insists on taking into consideration interaction across the Sahara Desert. Now, the linguistic, or what he calls linguistic analysis, separates the prefix ubu from the root ntu, and he considers ubu as an expression of ontology. So the prefix or prefixes in Bantu languages separate things as they are around us into specific categories. Ubu is then the abstract, while ntu is, as it were, the substance. It is what something is. He calls this the epistemological aspect of it. Now, this is the foundation, but what I think is really important is that this concept has recently, fairly recently, been used to include things and considerations that were primarily not part of it. So Ubuntu, if we say, is humanity, is the way humans relate to one another. One could easily say that it's perhaps anthropocentric, that it focuses only on human relations, and indeed a big part of it does, but many scholars in recent times have tried to redefine Ubuntu in more general terms. Very often, the way to speak of it is relationality, although there are also other concepts like ukama, which have sometimes been translated by this word. So a number of scholars are trying to integrate also the non-human world into a consideration of humanity. I have selected just one example of Professor Lenka Bula, who writes in her article Beyond Anthropocentricity, Butu, Ubuntu, and the Quest for Economic and Ecological Justice in Africa. So she basically opposes the idea that Ubuntu must be read only in terms of human relations, and she insists on the concept having the capacity to integrate also perspectives on something that goes beyond the human community. I don't know why I'm flipping, why the image is always flipping sideways. Is it just my computer? Anyway, I hope it's not too disturbing. Right. Basically, Professor Lenkabula chooses the Sutu concept of Butu instead of Ubuntu because she feels more familiar with it as a Sesotho speaker. But she says that Butu is essentially the same thing as Ubuntu. She says Butu is a key norm in the quest for ecological justice against exploitative human relations, economic systems, and power issues. Now, here she goes on to define what Butu actually contains, what it encapsulates. She says it's a Sesotho word which describes personhood and humaneness. It has an ontological, socio-political, economic, ecological, and religious dynamic. So again, you can see that the concept has been given this very, very broad meaning, and a lot of meanings, in fact. And Lenkabula suggests that it has the capacity to express all of these aspects at once. She says it explains the relationship of humanity to themselves, as well as the embeddedness of human life to the ecological life, thus highlighting that the self can never fully be without the ecological systems within which they exist. Butu is an expression of people's dual identity that is in relation to themselves, as well as in relation to creation other than human. I think this quotation is particularly interesting because it shows perfectly how the concept of relationality works. You relate other things, including the environment, or what she calls creation, and you can see a certain creationist impetus there, creationist understanding of the world. So she relates also these aspects of human life to humanity as such. Ubuntu then, or Butu in her reading, becomes a much broader concept that has the capacity to create a, as it were, cosmic relationship of beings and of environments. She explains the concept further. We have the conventional explanation through mutu ke mutu kabatu babang. A person is a person through other people. And she insists on the difficulty to operate with this concept in Western languages. She clarifies or qualifies the concept of Butu with these other concepts such as individual well-being and wholeness. And she goes on to say that Butu implies at minimum, a sensible acknowledgement of the rights of others. It also recognizes the relevance of equality, self-respect, health, opportunities, income, wealth, and relations with the cosmos, the planets, and creation. So in this sentence, you can see that Lenkabula is integrating not only human rights and economic aspects of human existence, but also the embeddedness of humanity in the universe. I will skip this. Now, Lenkabula is by far not isolated. There are a number of thinkers who try to do the same move, which is to use the concept of Ubuntu, Butu, or the other cognates of the concept to really, as I said, integrate humanity within a much wider context of the planets, the cosmos, the universe. I would like to conclude this section now, speaking about normative idealism. Why did I call it normative idealism? I think it's very clear now. It is normative because it creates a normative concept of humanity. Being human has normative qualities. And it is in a way idealistic because it really outlines how humanity should be, but it does not always account for things which may be problematic. For instance, there are scholars who criticize the fact that the philosophy of Ubuntu is inapplicable in situations where people are simply different. For instance, for LGBTQ communities. So sometimes the concept simply does not work. There are other scholars who criticize the concept for only working within small communities, typically a village. But how do you apply this concept in an urban setting? So the megapolis of Africa, of contemporary Africa, actually create quite a challenge for this concept. On the other hand, there are scholars who say that Ubuntu can be also reproduced by means of virtual communities, by means of creating a digital community, such as a Facebook group or similar, where the same qualities of Ubuntu can apply among the members. So it is, I think, a very rich concept, but it really depends on what you do with it, philosophically speaking. And I think there are many pitfalls on the way. Quite a different perspective on humanity can be found in this other trend that I called critical realism. I will rely mainly on the thought of Patrice Nganang, which I find very straightforward, very clear. It defines the outlines of this trend. And also one has to note that Nganang himself suggests that there is only one philosopher who in fact does what he does, who thinks in a similar way, and that's Achille Mbembe. Achille Mbembe's thought, of course, is extremely rich, and it contains a lot of trends that we could pursue in this lecture. But I would now like to focus on the way Nganang portrays Mbembe and how he presents Mbembe's thought and also his own thought towards this critical reflection on humanity. Before I, however, go into that, I would like to point out that, of course, if I speak of normative idealism and critical realism, I am speaking of individual thinkers or specific concepts, but of course there are many others who could also be grouped under that heading. In particular, there are a number of scholars from Nigeria, for instance, the Calabar School of Philosophy, who are quite aligned with the thinking of Ubuntu philosophy. So in a way, I would say the tension that I was speaking about applies not only to the philosophers of Ubuntu, but also to people who follow a similar strategy in philosophy, that of defining normative concepts and then somehow imposing them on the field. Critical realism, on the other hand, again, one can find many thinkers who would pursue that kind of critical reaction, but it has to be said that many of them would not define themselves as philosophers. They would be maybe theorists more broadly. Back to Patrice Nganang. Nganang speaks of the Rwandan genocide. Now, before we go on discussing this extremely difficult topic, I have to say that it is important to realize that Nganang does not speak of that one event per se. He takes it to be metonymical, to actually speak on behalf of many African wars and genocides. And he also sees Rwanda as a manifestation of something that affects the whole of the continent. I'm now quoting his work, which is called, I think, Manifeste de la littérature nouvelle africaine. It has a very long title. But I just want to point out the translations are mine, so any shortcomings should be addressed to me. He says it was the whole of Africa that was at stake on the 1,000 hills of Rwanda. Really, Rwanda stands for Africa for him. He also says that the Rwandan genocide was not a crazy moment, not a crazy moment of African history, not an epiphenomenon, but a foundational event of African philosophy. So this very event to him changes the course of African philosophy, changes the way Africans should conceptualize their thought. So there is a very, very sort of strong effort on his part to suggest that should be done. He calls the Rwandan genocide the philosophema of our time because it prompted the need to imagine oneself from its heap of corpses. He speaks of the brutal awakening of thought, and he also speaks of the failure of humanity at the heart of Africa. I think here you can immediately see the huge tension with normative idealism, which sees the human being as, well, normative, as good, as ethically positive somehow. Nganang further speaks of a slap in the face of the sleepy African intelligentsia. So again, he's quite vocal in his criticism of current or the existing African philosophical trends up to then. He says the slap resonates in the depth of the entire African library. So he considers, or he suggests that there is not a reaction that was really up to par with what happened in Rwanda. Now, he makes comments about the genocide as it relates to this failed humanity, as he called it. He says, the tragic paradox is that the genocide makes the African fully human. It is because, being a paradigmatic rupture with 200 years of Africanist and Africanizing thought that have for a long time understood the African, in quotation marks, as someone special, extraordinary, it is the violent entry of the African into simple, that is, flawed humanity. Now, Nganang sees the genocide as the inception of a new African philosophy. And he sees that new African philosophy as being critical of what African philosophy was like until that moment. Together with Bamber, his African modes of self-writing, he identifies two trends as being these trends up to the genocide that he perceives very critically. On the one hand, to him is what he calls secular Marxist messianic revolutionary thought, and on the other hand, and Afro-radicalism, and on the other hand, identitarian thought, or nativism. He suggests these tend to see the African human being as somehow different from other people, and they are based on a logic of victimization, as he calls it. And I will conclude my discussion of Nganang with this quotation where he takes issue with some of these trends, and he names them explicitly. So where he was speaking of identitarian thought or nativism, he now points his finger at some specific trends within African philosophy. He says, identitarian thought in all its forms is guilty to have given the murderers of the Great Lakes the foundations of their flawed madness. It is not only the theory of the Egyptian origin of African peoples that got a shower of blood in the Rwandan genocide. It is not only the theory of race that permeates texts of the Egyptologist Afrocentrism, as well as of African nationalism, both becoming explosive in the hateful elaboration of the features of the Tutsi face. It is the very pillar of rationality that supplied the ideological grounding for this form of analysis and that has shattered. Rwanda is without a doubt the graveyard of negritude, as well as all of its conceptual corollaries. So I think this quotation really powerfully expresses Nganang's attitude. It is for him necessary to interrogate very critically the essentialism that is implicit in many of these trends of African philosophy up to the moment of the genocide. And I think he would also apply them to some of the trends that perhaps were summarized in what I call normative idealism. Also, those are based on certain essential differences, African thinking with respect to the thinking of other people. Now, this is just a note on Bamber. I thought I would just mention it here. He speaks of thinking from a morbid place, of having the courage to think from what he calls the terrible precipice of destruction and auto-destruction. And he sees Bamber as perhaps the only thinker who actually lives up to that ambition. Now, with this, I have outlined these two trends within African philosophy of the last roughly quarter of a century, an idealistic one and a critical/realist one. Of course, they are not equally vocal, equally visible. They also exist in different places, so to speak. Some of them in the diaspora, some of them in African countries, some of them in English, some of them in French. And then, of course, there are many trends also in Portuguese, for instance, that could speak back to one or the other in one way or another. In my concluding part, I would like to flag up what I called margins and absences in African philosophy. So we have covered these two trends, and we have also shown that they, in a way, dominate the discussion. Ubuntu is the concept that is often used to discuss just about everything in African philosophy: animal rights, human rights, bioethics. Everything tends to be related to Ubuntu. On the other hand, I think I also don't need to speak about the impact of the thought of people like Bamber. But what is absent in these debates? What is missing? So I will outline certain possible future trajectories, and I think I have 4 of them, if I'm right. They actually work together, and I will then give you a short taster, a short example of where I think African philosophy could be going, or where I see it going in certain, in some of its margins, so to speak. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting that actually these four concepts, although they are essentially unrelated, they do work together towards something future, so to speak. The first one is the non-human. So both Nganang and the thinkers of Ubuntu insist on humanity. Humanity is always at the center. Indeed, the Jewish Jamaican philosopher Louis Gordon says, "I know of no African philosopher who has not argued that African philosophy is humanistic." So African philosophy is qualified by thinkers, even by critics, as something which is fundamentally humanistic, if not anthropocentric. Now, the foundations of this humanism are usually located in 2 areas. One is African worldviews or cosmologies, where humanity is always at the center and mostly on top of other beings, such as animals, the inanimate world, and so on. And there is a kind of course, the vertical relationship to some deity or God. So that's one. And the other is social practices. And that's actually where Ubuntu comes from. Being human among humans is quite obviously a very fundamental philosophical insight, which grounds the humanistic philosophy within African philosophy. However, it becomes very clear, especially I think in recent years, and in a way the COVID crisis has been an addition to that reasoning, that a humanistic philosophy is simply not sufficient. It does not cope sufficiently with the challenges of the contemporary world. That's why Robert Grusin has coined the term the non-human turn. He suggests that the humanities, and of course he's here speaking mainly about Western philosophy, Western humanities, but he says that there is this very clear turn towards the non-human. And the non-human, of course, is defined in many different ways. If I can just read some quotations from his book, or the book he's edited, the non-human turn is engaged in decentering the human in favor of a turn toward and concern for the non-human, understood variously in terms of animals, affectivity, bodies, organic and geophysical systems, materiality, or technologies. Given that almost every problem of note that we face in the 21st century entails engagement with non-humans, from climate change, drought, and famine, to biotechnology, intellectual property, and privacy, to genocide, terrorism, and war, there seems no time like the present to turn our future attention, resources, and energy towards the non-human broadly understood. And finally, he clarifies that the non-human turn argues against human exceptionalism, expressed most often in the form of conceptual or rhetorical dualisms that separate the human from the non-human, variously conceived as animals, plants, organisms, climatic systems, technologies, or ecosystems. So Grusin argues that it is now time to turn towards the non-human, and he also, as you could see, the non-human is also part of the human. It really depends on how you define the human, and from the definition of the human, you then have a kind of differential definition of the non-human. In his own reading, of course, the human is the kind of enlightenment liberal subject, the human being as being capable of free will and of knowledge, of more or less impartial knowledge and knowledge progress. But of course, as I said, the non-human is always defined in opposition, in contrast to the human. Now, my suggestion is that the non-human is also something that African philosophy needs to speak about or needs to develop. Now, of course, the question is how and where. The next, and I will give you, as I said, I will give you an example of how that is happening. The next topic, however, is the future. So again, the future as a dimension of time that is opposed to the present and also to the past being seen as something that has overdetermined the African present. There is now a very, very prominent trend of Afrofuturism, although it is not under the aegis or under the umbrella of African philosophy. Afrofuturism is a trend of art and of scholarship that tries to conceptualize the African future, or an African future, or many futures. And it suggests that from the definition of the future, we can derive or we can change our present, and we can also change our past, or, well, depending on who does that exercise, of course. Now, I would like to quote this from an article by Kojo Eshun, a very famous article on Afrofuturism, further considerations on Afrofuturism, where he says that Afrofuturism's first priority is to recognize that Africa increasingly exists as the object of futurist projection. African social reality is overdetermined by intimidating global scenarios, doomsday economic projections, weather predictions, medical reports on AIDS, and life expectancy forecasts, all of which predict decades of immiserization. Africa is always the zone of the absolute dystopia. So what Kojo Eshun is saying, that the future always exists, and now it depends on, the important thing is who imagines that future. And he's suggesting that African and Afro-diasporic artists who subscribe to Afrofuturism try to change the imagination of the future for Africa, and also for the African diaspora in the world. And it is a really important exercise to implement. Now, Afrofuturism very often deals with ecological issues. a lot of Afrofuturist novels, films, but also music, deals with world apocalypses, with ecological crises, with the climate change, also with things that are broader than this planet. So there is a very strong, so to speak, narrative technique that is drawing on sci-fi. And in that way, I think Afrofuturism perfectly sort of dovetails with what I said about the non-human. It really looks at the future as being defined by something that that goes beyond mere humanity. The two next points concern the form of that thought. And one is language. Now, why is language so important? If you look at a selection of excellent books on African philosophy, and I have just selected a few from as many languages, well, not as many, but from the main languages. If you look at these books that represent the field, so to speak, you can see that all of them are in languages of European origin. You can find books mostly in English, in French, in Portuguese. You can find books in Russian, in Italian, in Czech, in German, but you will struggle to find books like that in African languages. So there is, of course, that big question, do African philosophies exist, or rather, what are they? Where are they to be found? And in my opinion, the answer to that question lies in the question of genre, which is the textual form of expression, the way you express your thinking. While philosophy, African philosophy as a field, has mostly insisted on non-fictional prose as its genre. Think of Odera Oruka, who speaks of second-order discourse as something that characterizes philosophical thought. So he really speaks of that kind of abstract reflection as characteristic of philosophy. In many African cultures, in many African languages, there are other genres that are used to express philosophical ideas. Alexis Kagame, whom I already mentioned, he wrote non-fictional prose in French, but he also wrote amazing poetry on philosophical topics in Kinyarwanda. There are writers who think about ecological catastrophes, but they don't write a non-fictional treatise on that, they write a novel. So my suggestion would be that one needs to consider very seriously texts in African languages and possibly in genres that do not look like what people tend to think that philosophy looks like. Because the fact that most philosophy is non-fictional prose is simply a historical contingency. It is simply something that has happened. But it was not always like that, and it does not need to be like that. It is not like that in many cultures. So I think genre is a very important concept in understanding philosophy in general. Just a little note by Karen Bamber, who says that genre needs to be understood because to ignore genre is to ignore a text's relation to history and social context. Yet it is remarkable how often historians and anthropologists, and we can add philosophers, try to read a local text raw without considering what genre it might belong to or what conventions may have gone into its constructions. Texts are often treated as testimony that can speak for itself without mediation. She also insists on the fact that genres actually, they always exist in a symbiosis. They speak to one another. There is really an ecology of genre, so to speak, that is at work in any particular culture. So Karen Bamber insists on the need of context-sensitive emic understanding of non-Western genres, combined with a larger scale comparative view of the emergence and transformation of genres in relation to changing social reality. Now I'm almost at the end, This is actually the ERC project that was mentioned in the introduction. It is precisely this effort to address the issue of genre in philosophy. And I have listed the case studies that we work on in the team. The poetic philosophy of Alexis Kagame, who worked with adaptations of oral poetic genres in Kinyarwanda. The essay, so that is actually non-fictional prose, but in Chiluba. Sufi poetry in Swahili and Wolof, the novel, digital texts, tweets, blogs in English and Swahili, Anglophone speculative fiction, and also a kind of mixture of genre or cross-genre interactions in French. So these are some of the genres that perhaps are an important field for African philosophy. And to conclude, I would like to show you a case study. Here you can see that actually all of these considerations about some future or possible trajectories of African philosophical thinking and its study. I consider myself more a historian of philosophy than a philosopher, or if you like, even an anthropologist of philosophy, as Professor Kai Kresse calls it. So in this case study, I would like to speak of how the non-human is conceptualized in Afrophone scholarship, and the non-human is conceptualized here as the world. And I would like to just show you the procedure, basically starting from one text in a specific genre, and then using that text as a kind of lens to understand other texts and to read them with respect to some kind of basic philosophical insight. Now, the text, the one text, is actually a pre-colonial Swahili poem. It is called AlInquishafi. I mean, it has several different names. It was composed by Said Abdullah bin Ali bin Nasir, a nobleman from Pate in East Africa, around 1800s. And now this text, here is a sort of image of part of the manuscript. As you can see, the manuscript is what is called Adyami in African literature, African literary scholarship. Adyami are texts that are written in African languages, but using the Arabic script. And of course, there is a very substantial and rich corpus of this literature in West Africa, with languages like Wolof, Hausa, Fulani, and others, also Arabic, obviously, that are being actually studied very intensively in recent times. But there is also a very substantial body of that in East Africa, most often studied under literary studies or philology. And this is one poem. It's not isolated. It is part of a sort of long tradition of poetry from the East African coast. And what is really interesting about this poem is that it conceptualizes the human and the non-human. The human in this poem is the capacity to resist the world. It is the capacity to say no, the capacity to be yourself and avoid being tempted by something which is outside of your control. And that something is the non-human. So the non-human is just about everything except for that capacity to resist which is in you. Now, the non-human is called the world, or dunia in Swahili. Now, dunia obviously is of Arabic origin, and we will also see that this concept is very important also in West African scholarship. And the world is characterized in AlInquishafi by several categories, by several adjectives, and I have listed them here. The world is worthless, the world is impermanent, deceptive, and destructive. So you can see a very, very elaborate and also very, if you like, pessimistic perception of the world. Now, if we take this insight, this basic insight, the poem contains a basic insight about the non-human, about the world. If we take it as a foundational insight for a philosophy of the non-human, where do we get from there? We can take the poem as something that has continuity in certain other texts, and also something that can serve as interpretation without an explicit continuity. And I would like to do that for these four adjectives. I would like to show you how they can be, or this reading of the world can be very helpful in understanding phenomena of the 20th century, for instance. The first one, the world is worthless. So the first one is the phenomenon of socialism, if you like, communism even. We are speaking here of the Tanzanian socialism called Ujamaa, which has been described by Euphrates Keselahabi in this book. It's a novel, Dunia Uwanja wa Fujo. The world is an arena of chaos. Now, the word chaos, actually, I have to put a footnote there. The title itself is a saying, which meant originally the world is an arena of human effort. But in contemporary Swahili, Fujo means chaos. And Keselahabi indeed plays with that level of confusion between these meanings, or not confusion, conflation, we can say. So using this concept of dunia, and Keselahabi was or knew very well the poetry of the East African coast, and he very consciously referred through intertextual references to poems such as AlInquishafi and others. So through this concept of the world, Keselahabi is reading the failure of Tanzanian socialism, of Ujamaa. Of course, Ujamaa was, well, it was very important politically, but it led to a huge economic chaos in Tanzania. People suffered through the kind of classical socialist measures, such as the nationalization of private property, the dispossession, the loss of traditional values, of traditional social structures. So for Keselahabi, Ujamaa is part of the world, and since the world is, as we know, unpredictable, deceptive, and worthless, it is no surprise that Ujamaa as part of the world has led to the sort of failure and to a lot of suffering. So Keselahabi uses this concept of dunia to understand what happened during Ujamaa. Dunia is a principle of degradation, of entropy, if you like. And of course, the world is worthless, and if you, human being, invest yourself in it, you are worthless, like the world. This is exactly what has happened in this particular novel. Now, using the concept dunia now, but moving elsewhere, the world is impermanent. This is, as I said, this is now using that text as a lens to read other texts. This is moving into West African thought, also impacted by very similar Muslim Sufi ideas, such as that about the world. And here, almost literally, we see the same word, Adina, the world, where again, Boubacar Boris Diop, a prominent Senegalese writer, is using these poems like AlInquishafi, although he's not referring to AlInquishafi itself, but similar poetry exists also in Wolof. He's referring to those to understand, in this particular case, life and also separation, migration. I mean, the novel is immensely rich, and there are a lot of themes that are read through these references to Adiami texts and to Wolof poetry and songs. Moving even further from that corpus, the world is deceptive. Again, if we look at how the world is deceptive, what does deceptive actually mean? Deceptive means that the world has a level which is apparent and one which is hidden. And often the hidden one is truer, more true than the apparent one. And this is something that is conceptualized in a novel in Lingala by Ngaibata Buayumi, who speaks of multiple worlds. He uses the word world, mokili or mikili in the plural. Some of them are true, some of them are apparent, and there is also a special skill to intuit, to understand the true worlds. And finally, the world is destructive, and I will end on a fairly pessimistic note, because as I was sort of preparing the slides and sort of looking at the pictures, they really reminded me of what we see in the news these days, basically apocalypses and war novels. So again, if we take this basic intuition that the world is corrupted, deceptive, destructive as its nature, what happens when we use that to read texts that describe destruction and war? And again, for a case study, there are multiple. For war novels, of course, there is a very interesting corpus, for instance, in Shona and Ndebele, but I would just like to mention what I call Swahili apocalypses. These two authors, William Kufya and Euphrates Keselahabi, again, Keselahabi, we see him again. They have written novels that deal with an apocalypse, with a radical ending of human civilization. And one can really read those novels with that philosophy of AlInquishafi in mind and interpret the world as sort of leading towards a certain end. But they also interrogate that tendency towards, like that entropy, that tendency towards destruction, because in fact, both of them have a little spark of light at the end, and they actually create, you know, in quotation marks, brand new worlds at the end of that destruction. So for Kufya, he lets people destroy the planet physically through a nuclear explosion and metaphysically through atheism, through lack of piety, through lack of respect for being. So the world is destroyed, but a new world is created by the agents of creation, which is angels and devils. And Keselahabi is also very interesting in these two novels. He has created a brand new world, so to speak, and also a brand new humanity, people who start thinking in a different way, speaking in a different way. They purge words like nuclear or war from their vocabulary, and they basically challenge the foundations of Western epistemology in their thinking. This is what he projects at the end of the second of these novels, Mzingile, which means labyrinth. The two novels work together. The apocalypse starts in Nagona, and then we see the effects in Mzingile. And towards the end, there is that kind of new world being created, intellectually, conceptually. So to wrap up, I have outlined certain key tensions and tendencies in contemporary African philosophy. And I have also suggested that one needs to perhaps look at other topics. I see the emphasis on the non-human as something that will need to characterize African thought in decades to come, already because of the ecological accents that we see in contemporary thought. So the non-human, also the future, planning for the future, taking responsibility basically, and taking agency, assuming agency in imagining the future, which is what Afrofuturism is emphasizing. And it is maybe a bit utopian, maybe a bit hopeful, but I think that African language, cultures, texts, and philosophies will play a major role in that rethinking on the field, in the field of African philosophy. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Rettová, for a very thoughtful and rich presentation. I now give over to Professor Makoni to start the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much for an insightful presentation. I've got a couple of questions. I want to take you up on some of the arguments you made very early on about the potential significance of African philosophy to contemporary events, which would be something I think consistent with Southern epistemology. Let me ask you this very concrete question. What role do you think an Ubuntu mindset may play in any peace negotiations between warring parties?
Well, I think the answer would be obvious in that Ubuntu will say that we are all related. So it's almost like a duty to come forward in peace negotiations. But there, I think Ubuntu is really idealistic because people simply, well, people create conflict before they create a resolution or reconciliation. So I do think that the Ubuntu philosophy does not have a recipe to bridge conflict or to help reconciliation, apart from insisting on this ontological unity of humans. I think that would be my answer.
So your answer would be, in short, that Ubuntu is irrelevant in context of conflict.
I wouldn't say irrelevant. I would say it is important as the willingness to see yourself in the other, so to speak, to see that relationality. But I also think that there is not really that answer to how to overcome the differences. I think that simply by saying the differences are irrelevant, you do not yet give the answer.
So are you then saying that Ubuntu does not have in its apparatus an ability to enable us to address the how do we get there? It can tell us about what is possible, but it has no inbuilt philosophical mechanism to explain how we will get there.
Yeah, I think that is my perception. But one also has to say that perhaps philosophy does not have to elaborate those mechanisms. That philosophy can say it is simply projecting how things should be, but does not necessarily have to say how to achieve that situation. So I think that is actually legitimate to say.
So Ubuntu and philosophy is fundamentally declarative, but not procedural. It's the what about the world, not how we will get to that world.
I wouldn't say all philosophy, but for Ubuntu, I think that would be the case.
That would be the case. Okay.
Okay.
Now, my next question is this. I like quite a lot about what you were talking about Ubuntu, but I've spent a large amount of my life in universities. So my question, which I'm addressing to myself, but which I hope you will help me think through, is what is the potential usefulness of Ubuntu in departmental governance? Assuming, for example, you were a head or a chair of a department, and you wanted to use Ubuntu as a philosophy of governance in your department, what would be the relevance of that? Is it useful? But I understand Ubuntu as a subject of study, but I'm now interested in Ubuntu as a mechanism for governance in university institutions. How would I go about using Ubuntu as a form of governance?
I'm not sure. That's a very difficult question because you are going back to this how, right? To this procedural aspect. I think Ubuntu, to me at least, it clarifies the fact that the human being exists in the eyes of others.
Okay.
Yeah, so the emphasis on action rather than on how you think you are as one person. So the emphasis on the appearance, and this is, I think, really interesting also if you think of the tension with the deceptiveness of the world. In a way, Ubuntu invites you to join the world full on, with full responsibility, and actually effectuate something that you want to do through the world.
Okay. I want to.
It answers your question.
Yeah, I want to say that I'm not talking about the how. Let me quote what you said, and then I'll try and answer my question. You said very elegantly that in Ubuntu, there's a belief that you are a person through other people, right? To some extent. That's one possible interpretation of Ubuntu. If that is the case, is it coherent then to argue that in terms of departmental governance, you could argue that you are a scholar through other scholars, in as much as you're a person through other people? You are a scholar through other scholars.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. And it really challenges a lot of, I would say, Western philosophers. I keep thinking of what Nietzsche said, that philosophers speak to one another across centuries. So in a way, you have to maintain your essence, your identity as a thinker, regardless of others. So I think if you apply Ubuntu, you can do it in two ways. You can say this is nonsense, because you as a scholar are really created through your context.
Other scholar, yes.
And I think that realistically speaking, that is the case. We all think about problems that have been dictated to us, so to speak, by others, whether we want it or not. Or you could say that Nietzsche is actually thinking of a Ubuntu sort of across centuries, but I think it does not really make sense, to be honest. But yeah, I think that's a...
In my recent writing on the topic of Ubuntu and departmental governance, I then say that you should think Ubuntu enables you to think of excellence differently. It enables you to think of achieving scholarly excellence together, right? That programs and departments tend to think of individuals achieving excellence on their own. But what Ubuntu does is to pull you in a different direction, in which you say, we achieve scholarly excellence together. In as much as we achieve humanity collective, we achieve scholarly excellence together. That does not make us identical. It simply means we are able to achieve singular and unique characteristics through the group, right? The group does not make us all identical. The group enables us to achieve singularity and uniqueness in scholarship. That you need the group in order for your singularity and uniqueness to take place. And that is made possible, I think, through Ubuntu, because I don't think Ubuntu says everybody is going to be the same. I think it says you become an individual through other people. So similarly, you become an individual scholar through other scholars. You achieve excellence through other scholars in your unit. Anyway, that's then my last question is this. is much more historical. You go back, for example, to Ubuntu, as cited in the work by David Yali Manisa, then you talk about Desmond Tutu, etc. So my question is this, historically, in what way is the notion and practice of Ubuntu changed across historical time? That it must be, there must be a sense in which the morphological characteristics of Ubuntu have subtly shifted across time. Right.
Well, I maybe would not say that the morphological characteristics have changed, because I think the concept is so
it remains the same.
Fluid, right? It accommodates many characteristics, and it depends on how you speak of it. That's how it is. But I think that there was a very decisive shift in that concept, perhaps when it was made very explicitly the pillar of African philosophy, which was precisely when it was deployed as a philosophy of reconciliation. And for this practice, I mean, there are a lot of descriptions on how it was deployed. And, it was deployed by evoking that community, forgiveness in community. It was also criticized for that. It was criticized for basically manipulating people to forgive when in fact they had not yet dealt with their trauma. So I think that for Ubuntu, it really, the year 1994 is a very important year for it. And as I suggested also in my talk, Suleiman Bashir Diagne would say that was when it became a philosophical concept. I think it was a philosophical concept before, but of a different philosophy. It was not deployed as a concept for reconciliation, as a legal foundation of reconciliation until the reconciliation process after the overthrowing of the apartheid. That's my perception of it.
Good, thanks. Let me stop here and give other people a chance to come in and comment either in the chat box. Chanel, it's up to you.
Thanks, Prof. Sangeeta?
Oh, then you also want to say something.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
I will first give to Sangeeta, and then I will come to you, Hugh.
So thank you very much for this very enlightening talk. I have a comment and then a question, and my comment is also related to the concept Ubuntu. You point out and you make a dichotomy, a binary between European, what you call European thought, where it is the I that goes then to the we, whereas in Ubuntu it is the we. And that then comes to the I. And I'm reminded of Lev Vygotsky's philosophical impetus, where it is the interaction of human beings that then leads to the intra-development. And scholars who have been influenced by him, including me, I mean, there is this huge literature on how learning then is how human beings can never be understood as being apart from the world around them. And so there is also this very strong emphasis in socio-historical thought, in activity theory, on using hyphens to highlight that. So then you would have this long hyphen of human hyphen, being hyphen, in hyphen relation with tools. So tools being both intellectual and material. And so there is this very strong parallel. What has not been discussed so far is the non-human in terms of, for instance, animals, and in terms of the case study that you presented. But there is this parallel. And you have Bakhtin talking about the word is always half someone else's. Jim Wirch, again, interpreter of Vygotsky, who takes up the copyright age that we live in. And this ties in well with Sinpri's comments that within scholarship, we are socialized into making things very individualistic, whereas we are constantly referencing, we are within this, so we grow and become. So that was my comment. My question is related to the concept that you say, that you offer to us in terms of critical realism. And within philosophy, there is this whole area attributed to Roy Bhaskar. And you don't mention that philosophical approach to understanding social sciences, and that takes it kind of opposes positivism and empiricism in a very particular way. Can you throw light on why you don't align or you don't comment Roy Bhaskar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I would say that dichotomy is not necessarily my own. Yeah, I mean, it is how the thinkers of Ubuntu create the foundation of Ubuntu by saying it is going from we to I. But I totally agree with what you said. There are so many theorists, also in European philosophy, that insist on the constitution of the individual through the collective. So in a way, there is a certain simplification which is used to define Ubuntu as going from we to I, but I absolutely agree with you that that is exists elsewhere. It's basically not specific to Ubuntu, and in fact, it is extremely interesting to realize how well Ubuntu, in fact, defines, for instance, the definition or constitution of the subject through texts. I mean, that is really, there are fascinating parallels between theorists of textuality, and you mentioned also other theorists. One can think of people who really emphasize how you are created through the contact with the other. I'm thinking of Levinas perhaps, or Martin Buber. So I think you are absolutely right. And I would not like to suggest that I take that argument, but it is often made. It is often made saying that Western thought really goes from the monadic, individualistic subject. The likes of Leibniz and Descartes are seen as the foundation of that philosophy. And African philosophy is going in the opposite direction. As to your question, I don't really have an answer. I simply wanted to clarify this fundamental tension within African philosophy. And it's true that I have not commented on many theorists. I'm sorry, I don't think I really have a very clear answer specifically to that.
Could I just make a comment? I don't think that it is European, because Vygotsky, Luria, and all of them are Russian, and we know so little about those philosophies. They have been interpreted and offered to us through people like Jim Wirch and others. So I don't know. Of course, it is not the geography that is important, but the fact that these are also alternatives. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, we can say Western maybe, but also you can say Russian is not Western. But there are also Western thinkers, Martin Heidegger. You know, you mentioned the hyphenation. That comes from Heidegger. So I agree with you. It's very interesting to look at it geographically. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. For the sake of time, I will not read all the comments, but I do alert you to the Borges comments that was made during the presentation. So please, if you have time, quickly go and look at that. I will now give the floor to you for a comment. Or for a question, sorry.
Sorry, was that me or am I?
No, sorry, Julia, first you, and then,
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Sorry. Yes, Alena, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and this is a brief comment, and that ends it in a question, because I am very much interested also in kind of epistemologies from the South, and I've worked with and read some of the extremely rich things that come from Africa, and but I have worked a lot with 4 indigenous groups in Colombia, in Latin America. In regards to the question of genre, this has been kind of a conducting philosophical dialogues with them about different issues. But one of the things that very quickly I very quickly understood was that it was the whole, people like Lewis Gordon also speaks about shifting the geography of reason. I also saw the necessity of shifting the temporality of reason in order to understand specific ideas or concepts, because they simply imply a different way of conceiving of time, where the future is actually here as much as the past. For example, by speaking with ancestors, and by thinking as ancestors, and this is something that is common in other indigenous philosophies. So my question would be, in terms of, for example, Ubuntu or your knowledge of African philosophies, is there any temporal dimension to that? So you spoke about how it can break some specific logics, but I think the Afrofuturism operates within a kind of, we could say, a linear conception of time, right? But I'm really interested in knowing more about what you think about this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if I answer pertinently to your question, but maybe I'll develop a little bit the ideas of Afrofuturism. Actually, Afrofuturism, I would not say it's necessarily a linear understanding of the future. The future is simply something different, something that makes it possible for people to reflect on the present and the past. And I would not say explicitly, but implicitly, Afrofuturism challenges various thinkers of the African time. Again, I'm using quotation marks because I don't think there is one conception, but sometimes thinkers tend to simplify things or create these dichotomies that Sangeeta has actually rightfully criticized. John Mbiti, a Kenyan pastor and philosopher, suggested that thinking about time in African societies was in terms of only 2 dimensions. He says there is the past, which he calls zamani, using the Swahili word. He also sometimes calls it with a Kikamba word. And there is the present, which he calls sasa. Again, sasa is a Swahili word as well. And he also has a Kikamba concept for that. But what he says is that sasa is just the kind of moment of the present, which extends a little bit into the future and a little bit into the past, is the time of our life, while the past, zamani, is, if you like, the mythical past. It is the time of the ancestors. It is the time when meanings were actually made, right? The first meaning making is situated in this mythical past. And the mythical past then sort of flows into the sasa, into the present, and the sasa is but a regurgitation of that mythical past. So you have a kind of cyclical structure where the past really feeds into the present, and there is no way into the future. And that is actually the main problem for many thinkers, because if you exclude something radically new from happening, simply because it did not happen in the past, then you stop yourself from, if you like, developing yourself, from development. So from the perspective of politics and economy, of course, it's quite important not to create that cyclical structure, but keep the future open and malleable, changeable. So there was a lot of discussion with Mbiti, a lot of scholars who criticized this or that aspect of his philosophy. But I think that Afrofuturism is the most radical challenge to Mbiti, so to speak. It really insists on the future being not only a time for itself, a dimension, a new dimension created on top of our contemporary existence, but that future actually also changes the present, and it also changes what we see from the past and what we consider important from the past. So if you imagine yourself successful in the future, for instance, then you will look for a past that leads to that successful future. If you see yourself as a victim of diseases or a climate catastrophe, of course, you will look for causes that led you to that failure in the future. So I think Afrofuturists really insist on the power of the future to, they say, reprogram or even pre-program the present and the past. But I would say that maybe Mbiti is one of the most radical thinkers of a different understanding of time in that sense.
Good. Chanel, Eutropax Lomax
Yes.
wanted to say something, then we can move on to Lynn. Yeah.
Sure, please go ahead. You are muted.
Mhm.
I'm not muted now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, well, thank you for letting me in. And I must say, I very, very much enjoyed that talk, which I found extremely illuminating. I first came to Africa about 60 years ago, and one of the first Swahili expressions that I learnt when I arrived here was the expression Umtu Watu, which means a person is people. And so ever since then, I've been reflecting on this saying and wondering what impact it has on people's lives here and how they treat one another and how they anticipate the experiences of life. And the thing I would say about Umtu Watu, which of course is a way of expressing the same idea as Ubuntu, is that the Watu is not just a collection of random other individuals, but it is the whole society. And that just as a tree, as a forest, enables the trees to grow together and thrive, so the society as a whole makes it possible for individuals to be who they are. And of course, you can't have a society without individuals, and you can't have an individual without a society. And the expression Umtu Watu stresses the importance of the group, of the collective, of the social, which helps people to understand their own lives and thereby to relate to one another. So that is my first general comment. I seem to have oh yes. Now I think you can see me. That's my first comment. Secondly, can I make a small linguistic comment? And that is, I think I understood the speaker correctly to say that in the word Ubuntu, the Ubu part of it expresses a sort of general idea, and the Ubuntu part of it concretizes that idea and gives it more precise meaning. I would like to suggest an alternative perspective based on how I think Bantu languages work as agglutinating languages, which is that there are a large number of core concepts represented as morphemes, and attached to these concepts are a variety of prefixes and affixes which give variation to the core meaning. So that instead of saying that Ubu is the main idea and Ubuntu is some concretization of that idea, if that is what was said, I'm not sure I understood it fully, but I would say the opposite, that the core idea is Untu, or tu. In Swahili, it's just the syllable tu. In the local language where I am in Kenya, it is Untu. And if you take that idea, what is tu? I would say that tu is an expression of the core phenomena of human experience. What are those phenomena? They are other human beings, things other than human beings, that includes animals very often, and events or acts, those three. So in the local language where I live in Kenya, which is a language called Kimeru, for example, we have the root Untu, and attached to that root is a mu, which gives us muntu, plural antu, that is people, and we have gentu, plural into, which is things, and we have untu, plural mantu, which is acts and events. And then subordinate to all those in some way is Ubuntu, which is the same as Ubuntu. So somebody said that African philosophy is essentially humanistic. Well, of course it is humanistic, but it's not just humanistic, because if you take these core phenomena of people, things, and events or acts, they very much express the way in which African societies, individuals in those societies, lived their lives. And so I would say that African philosophy is not wholly humanistic. I would say that it is that it covers far more than the human element. And if one looks at the language, which is the main evidence that we have for the philosophy of Ubuntu, the structure of Bantu languages points us in this direction. So I would like to ask the speaker what she thinks about that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very, I think, insightful comment. What I said, or I quoted Morobe Ramose on what he said about Ubuntu. That's when he said that the Ubu was, he linked it to ontology and Ntu to epistemology. And this was something, I mean, I'm also a linguist, actually. I have studied, I speak Swahili, I speak Isindebele. So I was quite intrigued by what he meant by that. And I have discussed it with several South African colleagues. And it's from there that I got this idea that the ontology could be, I think, and that's sort of my interpretation of it, the ontology could be the sort of projection of specific semantic categories upon the world. I would not say being, I would say simply the world around us. And then Ntu is, yeah, it is, I would not call it epistemology, but it would be the actual things. And of course, what you are saying is correct in that this is actually, it does not make sense if you start from the languages themselves. It is simply an attempt to assimilate the language and the linguistic expression of Ubuntu to this kind of division between epistemology and ontology, which is actually taken from Western philosophy, or from the kind of classic division of Western philosophy. So I do think that it would be much more fruitful to start thinking from the languages themselves and using the languages themselves. And that's also why I think it's very important to actually look into how texts in those African languages deal with these topics. And you will not find the ideas that you find in, say, English language discourse in those texts. So I totally agree with you. I think it's very interesting, and thanks for the comments on Kimeru. I think the situation is very, very similar to other Bantu languages. And of course, one also has to think of, it's not just Mtu ni watu or Mtu ni utu, but also Mtu si kitu. A human being is not a thing. So it's very, very interesting actually how these things are connected in the language.
If I may make a last suggestion, I won't take up another minute of your time. I would suggest that a better word for African philosophy would not be Ubuntu, but the made-up word Ubuntu. That is to say, you take the concept of Ubuntu, which is those primary phenomena of human experience, and then you stick the abstract prefix U in front of it, and you get Ubuntu. And that includes everything that we human beings experience in our lives: people, things, and events.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Chuck Lomax. I will now give over to Lyndon Lewis.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. And I want to ask a question that is slightly peripheral to your main topic. And that is, you quoted somebody as saying that, I think it was Rwanda was the graveyard of negritude. And I'd like you to comment on that, because to say that is to suggest that it has this finality to it. And it seems to me as though negritude is a particular incarnation of Black assertiveness. And insofar as Aimé Césaire continues to be a popular person in academic circles, even if in relation to Fanon, I'm wondering if you could say something about the way in which that notion of the finality of negritude was quoted by you.
Thank you. That's a very important question. Yes, I quoted Patrice Nganang saying that the Rwandan genocide was the graveyard of negritude, and I think he does mean that finality there. He is critical of negritude as part of what he calls identitarian thought. So it is, I think the implication would be that asserting an identity based on some kind of essential qualities, which is the case of negritude, would be a case of identitarian thought. And he says that kind of identitarian thought leads to the massacre of the genocide. So you basically create essential differences, you define the other, and that's inevitably also what negritude does. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I think that it is indeed what Nganang was suggesting, that kind of definition of the other leads to something like the genocide. The genocide is defined as a conflict between people defined according to certain essential qualities, be it ethnicity, be it well, other qualities as well. So I agree that it's very problematic from the perspective of identity politics, and that, of course, it's a very, I think it's meant to be a very provocative statement. But in my opinion, Nganang wants to highlight how certain trends of thought can lead to very problematic implications or employment, deployment. Yeah, I think that's what I would say about that.
Okay, I will now take a comment by a question by Adrian. Regarding trends in African philosophy, one questions whether semantic differentiations are important, if not confusing. The fact is the logic of Ubuntu is fundamental, even in the work of Placide Tempels, La Philosophie, Bantu. The latter, as you know, is a teacher of Alex Kagame and many others. Yet having the Rwandan tragedy as a foundational moment in African philosophical discourse does not overlook apocalyptic scenes in African history, such as those unveiled by Joseph Conrad. They led African philosophers, sorry, lost my place, like Otonji, mainly Fabian Ebusi-Bulaga, to speak of the Muntu crisis as anthropological. It's a crisis on Ubuntu. And then also Adrian refers to Mbiti, which you did refer to as well. So if you would like to just comment on Adrian's question/comment.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not coping with the comments. There are many and they are long, so I can manage to read at the same time as I listen to the others speaking. Okay. But it's not, I don't mean to ignore them, but I'm just not coping with the multitude of text. But I'm now looking at this comment question. Yes, thank you. I would almost say that you say the tensions that dominated African discourses in the 1990s on African philosophy, especially ethnophilosophy. I would almost like to suggest that this concept of ethnophilosophy is part of that previous phase of that, you know, perverted dialogue, so to speak. Ethnophilosophy as issuing from the whole questioning of African philosophy and its existence. And I see the 1990s as launching another debate about other topics where it is simply taken for granted that African philosophy is there, that it is substantial, that it has a lot to say, and it tries to say what it has to say on various topics. So in a way, I would see the debate on ethnophilosophy as something that would come before this rupture that is created by the 1990s. Yes, and by the way, Nganang is very critical of Mudimbe, whom you also mentioned there. He sees him as one who was really irrelevant to the genocide, irrelevant in the sense of failing to reflect on it, which for Nganang is very, I mean, he was sort of digging ideas about African past and the African archive, but he failed to respond to what Nganang, he's very expressive, of course. He says the heap of corpses in his backyard. I'm not sure if I if I answered the question. So yeah, basically I would see the ethnophilosophy as something that predates the 1990s, that characterizes the debate before.
Okay, a question by Basi Antia. Is the observed anthropocentric bias the outcome of philosophers not theorizing the commonly observed experiences of humans and animals interacting, communicating? There are proverbs on the animal-human interface in creative writing, example, Kamara les l'enfant noir. We find a universe of assemblages, one in which a human is not separate from animals, elements, and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is exactly what I would say, that simply look at the humanistic sides of African philosophy means overlook the places where African thinkers speak about the non-human. And I gave you some examples in my case study, but of course there is a huge literature about the non-human, about animals as well. By the way, Nganang himself, he has written an amazing novel from the perspective of a dog. So he actually has a dog narrator and he narrates human experience through this dog narrator. So he himself would be a good example as a novelist, however, not as a philosopher, as a novelist expressing himself on the interface between humans and animals. But already, you know, the work that you quote there, Kamaralai, it is not a philosophical work, right? It's a novel. So really, I think one needs to open the field to its other, as it were, its other genres, other you can call it literature, but I don't like the concept of literature because literature means something different in different cultures. But basically, scholarship, texts, thought in other genres than the non-fictional prose that philosophy often uses. So absolutely, I totally agree with this comment.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
we have a conundrum at the moment, lots of questions.